Number 1. The Walk. This is a weird story that happened to me quite some time ago. Have you ever had one of those times where it seems like bad things keep happening to you? I know that I absolutely have gone through that on more than one occasion, and this was one of those occasions. This happened on the weekend. I didn't go out on Friday night because I wasn't feeling very good, and unfortunately, that bad feeling just got worse overnight. I had some problems tossing and turning and feeling sick, which of course made it hard to sleep. And then it took me forever to even fall asleep. And once I did fall asleep, it ended up being dream-plagued sleep that didn't make me feel like I was getting rest. When I eventually woke up, I was at first surprised to find out that it was still dark outside. I looked at my clock and actually had a hard time processing what I was seeing. I slept and I assumed I had woken up in the early morning. But when I was finally able to understand what I was seeing, I realized that it wasn't dark because I hadn't slept long. It was dark because I had slept the entire day. To make things worse, I didn't really have anything to drink in the house other than water. And I thought when I was sick, it was always a good idea to have something better. You know, like orange juice or something like that. So even though I felt like hell, I decided it would be a good idea for me to try to at least make it down to the gas station in order to get myself some orange juice or something like that. I haven't mentioned it yet, but it was around midnight, which meant I'd been in bed for about 24 hours. However, I didn't feel rested. I actually felt pretty awful, to tell you the truth. But I thought I would need something like orange juice to get some calories in me, which is the main reason I decided to go in that direction. I set out to go to the gas station. I felt worse when I actually began walking than I had been when I was laying in bed, but I was sure that it would be worth it when I made it back with my drink. I was able to make it all the way to the gas station. Something had caught my eye before I went inside, though. It looked like a couple of guys who were hanging around outside were behind the gas station. I found that odd, because there really wasn't anything behind there. But I didn't think about it too much. I got myself my orange juice. I picked up a few snack items that I thought would be easier to eat, even though I was feeling bad. And with that, I went out of the store, and I began walking back to the dark streets that led to my home. I live in a really small town, so there normally were not a lot of people who were out that late at night. You would occasionally have a car driving by or something like that, but that was it. And I saw, as I was leaving, the two guys emerge from behind the gas station, and they were walking pretty slowly, pretty casually, but they started out in the same direction that I did. I am not normally a paranoid guy, and I wasn't really paranoid that night either. I find that often it's scarier to not be followed by somebody and just assume that you are. When you actually see people outside, it's never really as scary as you think it might be. I just first assumed they were walking in the same way. I'm not sure at what point that my point of view changed, though. Maybe it was brought on by how I was feeling. Or maybe it has something to do with how many times I kept looking back over my shoulder. Although I couldn't say for sure at some point, I really got paranoid about those two guys, and I honestly believed that they were following me. I tried walking faster, but also tried not walking so fast that it seemed like I was walking faster. I think anyone who has ever thought they were being followed, they would know exactly what I'm talking about. I kept myself on edge as I made it back to my house. My yard went upwards at a slight slant, so I had a habit of running the last bit of the way up to the slight hill, to the house, and then onto the porch. And in those couple of seconds that it took me to do that, I have to admit I was a little nervous, a little panicked, and that it was my own fault for doing that. And when I did make it to the door, I shot a look back at the two guys. They had seemed to be following me up to that point. I don't even know if they noticed me doing it or not, but also I didn't care. They were still walking and coming up to my house. If they had been following me, they were obviously not interested in catching me. I was able to get into the house and lock the door before they were even close to my yard. And I watched them from the window, and they just went further down the street. So after that I felt pretty relieved. But as long as I had been asleep, I still had no problem crawling back into bed. I decided I would try to lay in the dark for a while. I could do that and have my orange juice by me, and then just drink in the dark. I don't know how long I laid in bed. I don't know if I drifted off or not. I don't know any of this any more than I could have told you the reasons for what happened next. But I do know that as I was lying there, I heard what I thought was my front door closing. My heart skipped a beat in my chest. My mind went back to the guys I had seen following me. I began wondering, though, why they had broken into my home when they had seen me go into my house. I mean, if you're going to break into a house, wouldn't it make more sense if you broke into a house that no one was in? While I was thinking, though, something really interesting happened. I heard my cat, Sylvester, yeah, I know, I'm not that creative, start screeching, and then I heard a human being screaming in response. I got freaked out immediately, and then I got even more panicked and got myself up off my bed. I ran to the door, intending to go to my fireplace and get a poker, but as I went out the bedroom door, there was some more commotion, and as I got out into the living room, I noticed that two people were going right out the door. After I locked the door and called the police, I tended to my cat. His claws were very, very bloody, and that's when I realized that a guard cat can be just as good, if not better, than a guard dog. Number 2. When I was in high school, me and my friends would often sneak out of the house and meet up at this graveyard we all lived not too far from. We liked to meet there because it was a place where we could stay out as late as we wanted, drink, smoke, and otherwise do things we weren't supposed to, without getting caught. No one could see us in there, and no one ever came there at night. We did this quite often, and we never really thought much about it being a graveyard or being creepy. We were used to it there, and comfortable hanging out there. Even so, we tried to be respectful. We didn't leave our garbage behind, and we did our best to walk carefully around graves, not stepping on them. But these graveyard get-togethers did come to an end abruptly, after something happened that destroyed any possibility for me and my friends, most of them that were there anyway, to feel comfortable there again. One night there were about 6 of us meeting at the graveyard. It was pretty much an even mix of guys and girls, all of us about 16 to 18 years old. While the group of us were walking to our favorite spot to hang out within the graveyard, my friend and I fell a little behind the others. They were about 5 or 6 meters, or yards ahead of us. I will call the friend I was with Michael for this story. The walk to our favorite spot was a good quarter mile inside the graveyard. The path had no lights, so it's pretty much pitch black and really quiet. Michael was walking a bit behind me, and the rest of the group was getting farther and further ahead, so I turned to tell him to hurry up, and I saw that he wasn't walking anymore, but standing still, and was staring out and into the darkness at the trees that were surrounding the graveyard, and he had a look of sheer terror on his face. I followed his gaze, and I saw a huge black cat sitting on a tree branch. It was so startling it really gave me a jolt. It's 3 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere in a graveyard, and there's a giant black cat looking directly at us. It was solid black and silhouetted on the tree branch. I cannot express how truly creepy the sight was. It also was like the cat seemed to have an awareness, an unnatural intelligence the way it looked at the two of us, seemingly so intently. Michael asked me in a quiet and shaky whisper, without taking his eyes off the cat, "Do you see that cat in the tree?" I kept my eyes on the cat as well. Before I could answer, the cat looked directly at Michael, opened its mouth, and instead of saying meow, or other sounds cats are known to make, this cat said, in the creepiest scary movie, mocking, slow and drawn out sort of voice, "Michael." It felt like an eternity listening to it slowly enunciate my friend's name. It was so clear. It said his name, no mistake. It was so freaking scary, I could not help it. I booked it out of there, running and screaming all the way back out of the cemetery, and Michael ran right with me. Our other friends met us outside the graveyard shortly after. They heard me screaming and were kind of mad that I was ruining their good time. Michael was almost catatonic. He was white as a sheet and seemed to be trying to forget what had just happened already. I had to explain to our friends what had happened, but they thought I was lying or exaggerating, and didn't understand why we wanted to leave the cemetery. Michael will not talk about this to this day, and any time I broached the subject, he was noticeably unsettled by it, so I stopped talking about it many years ago. Number 3. The desert. The beauty of the desert is immeasurable, and there is that magic seemingly dances in the air. Whether it is the air, or the surreal colors at dawn and dusk, or the almost alien creatures that live there, it is certainly a mind-altering experience that you would have to see to believe. Whether it's the tiny pygmy owl that makes its home in the giant saguaro cactus, once occupied by the gilded flicker, or the huge black, gray, and tan desert tarantula that lives in an old round-tailed ground squirrel hole, locally called desert monkeys, or the 13 different species of hummingbirds that either reside around here year-round, or come up from Mexico during the spring to drink the water or nectar out of a myriad of residential feeders. It's like magic, a very unique and special magic, not to be found or felt anywhere else but here. Take for example the sunrises and sunsets. I believe the Sonoran Desert has the most beautiful sunsets in the world. Once close to sunset some years ago, I happened to be camping with my husband and my son on the Santa Cruz River, west of Tucson, under a huge single mesquite tree that sprawled out of a last standing remnant of the precious riverbank that had been eroded away after a particularly fierce monsoon season. The mesquite tree was the only thing holding this small patch of ground to the dry wash that it occupied, and it was under this tree that my husband, son, and I made our camp. It formed a perfect canopy, and blind to place the tent under. The effect was nearly complete invisibility, perfect for seeing many of the magic animals and creatures that live in the Sonoran Desert. Because of the time of year, however, which was mid to late March, most of the more dangerous animals, like the diamondback rattlesnake, the giant hairy scorpion, the giant centipede, and the venomous and particularly dangerous red scorpion, were still in their burrows, awaiting the first monsoon. Our campsite was positioned on a kind of plateau that was a few feet up from the wash off an estuary, which was just north of the Santa Cruz River. It was full of rocks and pockets of loose sand and adobe that had eroded off the banks along the tops and sides. Between the washes and the river, rocks and debris littered the dry flood plain, along with other mesquites, palo verdes, salt cedar, creosote bush, brittle bush, paints, and buffalo grass. Along the still existing banks back then were trees that were precariously perched, roots exposed to the desert sun, waiting for one last monsoon to bring just one more drink before the long dry season came up from Mexico. Because the sun was setting, my husband and son had gone to find firewood for the night. There's nothing like the smell of mesquite wood on a cold March night. They both gave me a kiss and said they would return before it got dark. I had no problem being alone. I always considered being alone a special time just for me. My surroundings and the creatures that resided there, whether cats or wild animals. Here, so far from my native Arkansas, I had found home again. It was like heaven. I sat back and just took in the quiet beauty and magic that was the Sonoran Desert at dusk. As I looked out over the perfection of the desert that lay before me, I heard the occasional rock and mourning doves cooing their soft calls. They sounded like a sad lament. Were they lamenting the setting of the sun? The end of another beautiful day? The intervention of night, or the uncertainty of a new tomorrow? The sun began to set. The blue of the open sky began to turn into mixtures of yellow, orange, red, and purple that would inevitably devolve into the deepest midnight blue, interspersed with stars, and if lucky, an at least crescent moon. As I gazed, nearly lost in the colors, I heard a slight noise, different from the many other sounds I had grown accustomed over the years living in and camping in the desert. I looked across the shallow wash that lay before me, in the direction of where I thought the sound had come from, but I saw nothing. After what seemed like a few seconds, I saw some birds fly up from that same direction. Thinking it was my husband and son, I was not concerned, and watched the birds settle into another area for the night. After some time, and because there were no more disturbances, I realized that there were probably just some birds who were now settled and sleeping. The peaceful silence was almost like a narcotic, lulling me into a sense of calm and security, but nonetheless responsive and alert. This special time alone to myself was only broken by the fact that I had to piss like a racehorse, and now would have to relieve myself. I stood and stepped off and down into the shallow of the wash. I could feel the temperature change on my feet and knees. It was cool, like the dusk, filling with the fading color of a sinking sun. The edge was about knee-high, obscuring the view of anything that might be lurking behind me. Taking one last look around, I unbuttoned and unzipped my jeans. I thought how inconvenient it was at that moment not to be male and just whipping it out and taking a piss. But alas, no. I had to squat and dig a hole like a cat in the sand so I wouldn't get splashed. I had to position myself just right and let loose. I was looking down at the sand in the dimming twilight when looking up I saw something coming towards me. A silent black form. It was about my height and moved gracefully as I squatted there in an utterly vulnerable position. A startled cry caught in my throat. It always did whenever I was frightened. I never cried out. I remained mute in my fear. My body was immobile. Even my urine stopped, frozen midstream. The form, silent as the grave, continued to move towards me, and I could only stare. As it moved closer and closer, the beat of my heart played havoc on my ears. I prayed I couldn't hear my fear. I felt as if my body shuddered with every beat. I could feel the unnatural rhythm keeping pace with the shadow as it came face to face with me. I dared not breathe, lest I alerted that I was alive. I made no move and no sound as its eyes met mine. Its face in the blackness bore barely visible, odd patterns of color beneath the black. The huge head carrying the inhuman eyes moved closer to my face. I felt the maddening tickle of its whiskers, and then the coolness of its giant nose almost forced me from my paralysis. It touched my cheek and rubbed along the ridge of my nose, just under the left eye, and seemed to sniff some scent there. In my head I argued with myself, "Flee, you fool!" My twin screamed out, "No, this thing will kill you." My other twin, "But you'll have a chance if you run." My other twin again, "How, you idiot? You got your jeans around your knees." Again the other, "But..." I was cut off in mid-debate when the shape and I heard voices. The black pupils of its eyes grew huge, as if visually saying, "He's with you?" It turned to face toward the sound, but it still remained mostly facing me, its ears pivoting instead of its head as the sound grew closer. Finally the creature's attention moved from me to flight. It turned swiftly, silently, and drove itself headlong into the low-hanging trees from whence it came. I was still watching it disappear, and only when it was gone did my body react, suddenly, with a sharp exhalation into the gathering night. Finally I realized I'd been holding my breath the whole time. It seemed like an eternity, but only a few minutes had elapsed. My stream of urine now resumed its mark into the sandy hole that I had dug. I slipped a napkin out of my pocket and shakily wiped. I covered the spot with my other hand and finally stood with difficulty on my gradually denumbing legs. After I had buttoned up and zipped, I moved back up to the campsite to my husband and son. My mind had moved from confusion to a clarity that I had seldom experienced, taking in every snapshot of memory and piecing them together, and then suddenly realizing what I had seen. As I relayed the story back to my husband and son, my husband said he had seen it once before as well. It had obviously come from Mexico, like they do every year to Tucson, then back to Mexico. Mexico is about 60 miles from Tucson. I said that the desert is magical, and even though I was scared to death, I was fascinated at the same time. It was later on, as I looked back, that I was convinced it was magic, and it was real. I had been kissed by a melanistic jaguar. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the Cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.